For 6 years she was the fastest thing on the ocean, and nothing the enemy sent could catch her. Grey from bow to stern and sailing alone, the Queen Mary carried more than 16,000 men on a single crossing, and over 750,000 across the whole war, while a bounty sat on her hull that no U-boat ever managed to collect. Winston Churchill crossed on her under a false name and planned the invasion of Europe from her staterooms. Today she is tied to a pier in Long Beach, California. Her engines have been cut out and hauled away. Her lifeboats were taken down because they had corroded into a danger to the hull that carried them. And pumps run inside her around the clock to keep her off the harbour floor. She was built to do one thing better than anything afloat: go fast. That is the thing that killed her. And the number at the centre of her story is not what she was worth when they bought her. It is what it would cost just to keep her from going under. $289 million. Hold on to that. Chapter 1. The Race Across the Water. For 100 years, the only way across the Atlantic was to sail it, and the crossing was a race. Not a race anyone announced. A race written into money. Whichever ship could carry people from Europe to New York fastest took the traffic. And the traffic was everything. The immigrants, the mail, the rich in their staterooms, and the poor down in third class. All of it went to whoever was quickest. A liner that shaved half a day off the crossing did not just win a headline. It won next season's bookings, and the season after that. So the great shipping lines built for speed. There was even a name for the prize, an unofficial honor called the Blue Riband, held by whoever owned the fastest crossing on the North Atlantic. It was never a trophy you could keep. It moved to the next ship that beat your time, and something always did, eventually. For 20 years the record had belonged to a single British liner, and the country had grown used to owning the ocean. Then, in 1929, the Germans took it with a brand new ship, and soon after they built a faster one. The French and the Italians drew up superliners of their own, longer, quicker, more beautiful than anything Britain had at sea. This is the ground the Queen Mary was born onto. Not a dream, not a vision. A market. The same one that had built every fast ship before her and had thrown each of them away the moment something quicker came along. The ocean did not care which flag crossed it fastest, or which engineer, or which company. It only ever paid the one who did. Speed was money. Money built ships, and the ships that were not fast enough were sold for scrap and forgotten. That law was running long before anyone drew her lines, and it would still be running long after. Hold on to one image while the people come and go. A hull, riveted steel plates, curved and hammered together by hand, shaped for a single purpose: to move through cold grey water faster than the thing beside it. That hull is the only part of this story that was there at the very beginning and is still here at the end. The men who built it, the captains who drove it, the passengers who crossed on it, the governments that fought over it. Every one of them was really working for something older than all of them and indifferent to all of them. It made them, and in time it would unmake them, and it would not notice either way. Speed was the whole point. Chapter 2. The Rusting Ship on the Clyde. Enter Sir Percy Bates, the chairman of the Cunard line, a man who had staked his company on a single idea. To win the Atlantic back, Britain needed 2 ships, and not merely fast ones. It needed the 2 fastest ships in the world, large enough to run a weekly service to New York between them, and quick enough to take the Blue Riband home from the Germans and never hand it back. It was an audacious plan, and the timing could not have been worse. Cunard set out to build two of the largest ships on Earth, at the precise moment the world could no longer afford much of anything. The first of them began in December 1930 on the River Clyde at the John Brown shipyard in the town of Clydebank. She had no name yet. On the books, she was only Job number 534. Nearly 4,000 men went to work on her directly, and 10,000 more in the foundries and steelworks and supply yards that fed the Clyde, hammering together the largest ship Britain had ever attempted. For a town like Clydebank, built around the yard and living off it, the ship was wages. It was rent and food and work for the whole town. Then the money ran out. By December 1931, the Great Depression had reached the Clyde, and Cunard could no longer pay for shipyard. Work stopped. The hull stood 4/5 plated, 9 stories of bare steel bolted together and going nowhere. And there it sat, out in the weather for the better part of 2.5 years, gathering rust while photographers came to take its picture. Across Britain, that unfinished hull became the image of the slump itself, a country that had begun something enormous and run out of the money to finish it. For the men, it was worse than a photograph. The 4,000 who had built her were sent home, and so were the 10,000 behind them. The rivet hammers went silent. In a place that made ships and very little else. The gates closed, and the town that had never known anything but the sound of the yard went quiet with it. Bates would not let her rust into scrap. Cunard went to the British government and asked for a loan to finish her, and the government agreed. But it attached a condition, and the condition was a strange one. Cunard had to swallow its oldest rival. White Star, the line that had built the Titanic, was dying of the same depression, and before it would put up a single pound, the government wanted the two great British companies folded into one. So in the spring of 1934, Cunard and White Star became a single firm, and the ship that would soon carry a Queen's name was saved by the quiet end of the company that had built the most famous ship in history. In April 1934, the gates on the Clyde opened again. The men walked back through them. Newspapers that had printed the rusting hull now printed the crowds returning to work. Share prices lifted in London on the news, and for a moment, a whole anxious country let out its breath. In the end, she cost £3.5 million to build. She had been saved. The price of saving her was the end of the company that built the Titanic. Chapter 3. The stateliest ship afloat. On the 26th of September 1934, 250,000 people crowded the banks of the Clyde to watch her go into the water, and until the last moment, not one of them knew her name. Cunard had kept it secret. By tradition, the company's ships ended in the letters IA, and the plan had been to call her Victoria. But when Cunard's men went to the palace to ask permission to name the new liner after Britain's greatest queen, King George V, answered that his wife would be delighted. His wife was Queen Mary. There was no polite way to tell a king he had guessed wrong, so the greatest ship Britain had ever built took the name of the woman who now stepped forward to christen her. The king called her the stateliest ship afloat. She was almost too big for the river that made her. The Clyde had to be widened just to let her out, and even then, as 35,000 tons of bare hull slid down the slipway, chains weighing more than 2,000 tons dragged behind her to check her before she reached the far bank. Then she met the sea for the first time. It took another 18 months to turn that hull into a ship. On the 27th of May 1936, She left Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York, every cabin booked long in advance, and when she came up the harbour, the city turned out to meet her. The crossing was the thing she had been built for, and now the world could watch her do it. That August, she took the Blue Riband. She lost it the following year to the French liner Normandy, took it back in 1938, and then held it, unbroken, for the next 14 years. On her fastest runs, she crossed the Atlantic at nearly 32 knots, quicker than any liner alive. The record Britain had lost to the Germans was home again, and this time it stayed. She was a city that moved. More than 1,000 feet of steel and over 80,000 tons, carrying 2,000 passengers and 1,100 crew across the ocean in under 5 days. Her 3 great whistles were pitched so low you could feel them in your chest before you heard them, tuned deep on purpose, so the sound would not hurt the ears of the people standing beneath them, and they carried for miles across the water. And she was beautiful. 5 separate bars ran along her promenade deck alone. Dinners were formal, black tie and evening gowns, served in a first-class dining room that rose 3 decks high. Film stars crossed on her, and prime ministers and the merely rich, and down in tourist class the not rich at all of them moving at the same impossible speed toward the same skyline. In those years before the war, to sail on the Queen Mary was to travel in the most glamorous way the world had yet invented. But the chandeliers were never the reason she mattered. A slower ship could have carried the same champagne and the same film stars. What justified the gamble and the loan and the rusting years on the Clyde was one thing only. She crossed faster than anything else on the water. Speed was the whole point. Chapter 4. The Grey Ghost. In September 1939, the champagne stopped. Within months, the chandeliers were crated away, the carpets pulled up, and the bright hull painted over in flat naval grey. Standy bunks went in where the drawing rooms had been, stacked 6 high. And the fastest passenger ship in the world became the largest troop ship in the world. Sailors started calling her the Grey Ghost, because at speed and in the mist she seemed to appear and vanish before anyone could be sure she was there. She carried soldiers the way she had once carried millionaires, which is to say, faster than anyone else could. She moved men from Australia and India and South Africa in the early years, and then, once America was in the war, American divisions by the hundreds of thousands, 15,000 men at a time, was not unusual. On one crossing in the summer of 1943, she carried more than 16,000 people at once, the most ever put aboard a single ship, a record that still stands today. Across the whole war, she moved some 750,000 troops. And she did it almost always alone, without escort, because no convoy could keep her pace, and she did not need one. Her defense was her speed. A submarine that saw her could not catch her. In 1944, one tried, spotting her on the surface and diving to attack, and by the time it was in position, she was already gone over the horizon. She was worth so much to the war effort that Hitler was said to have put a bounty on her, a fortune in cash and Germany's highest military honor, for any U-boat captain who could send her to the bottom. No one ever collected it. Winston Churchill crossed on her 3 times, listed on the manifest under a false name, Colonel Warden. He worked as she ran. On one crossing in 1943, in a stateroom that had lately held holidaymakers, he and his staff laid out the plan for the invasion of Europe. The most important passenger of the war travelled on the fastest ship of the war, and the ship never stopped moving the whole time he was aboard. It is late July 1943, and it is past midnight. More than 16,000 men are somewhere in the black Atlantic aboard a single darkened ship. No light shows anywhere along her. She is steering a zigzag, swinging her bow one way and then the other on a fixed pattern, so that no submarine ahead of her can guess where she will be a minute from now. Below deck, in cabins built for two, men lie stacked 6 bunks high, and there are so many of them that they sleep in shifts, one shift down in the berths, while another stands topside in the cold, waiting its turn to lie down. It is hot and close below and freezing on deck, and miserable in both places. And under all of it, never easing, is the sound of the engines. The whole hull hums with them, hour after hour, mile after mile, driving her through the dark faster than anything hunting her can move. She does not slow down. She will not slow down for anything. That was the whole of her genius, and it was the whole of her weakness. Speed had beaten the Depression, and the Germans, and every rival afloat. It had one flaw. It could always, in the end, be beaten by something faster. Speed was the whole point. Chapter 5. The Ship That Could Not Stop. There was one rule that came with all that speed. She never stopped. Not for weather, not for wreckage, not for men in the water. Because to stop in those waters was to sit still for a torpedo. And a torpedo into the Queen Mary meant thousands dead at once. The rule was absolute, and it was correct. And it had kept 16,000 men alive on a single crossing. On the 2nd of October 1942, it killed more than 200 of her own side. She was off the north coast of Ireland that afternoon, carrying thousands of American soldiers of the 29th Infantry Division, running her usual zigzag at speed. For the last stretch into Scotland, she'd been given an escort, an old light cruiser called the Curacoa, a small ship left over from the last war, there to guard her from aircraft. The Queen Mary was overtaking her. The collision came down to a misunderstanding between two captains. Both ships were zigzagging. Commodore Illingworth, on the Queen Mary, held to his pattern, expecting the smaller ship to keep clear. Captain Boutwood, on the Curacoa, held his course to stay in position as her guard. Each man believed the other would give way. Neither did. A little after 2 in the afternoon, the Queen Mary swung into a turn from a few hundred yards astern of the cruiser, and by the time either captain understood, there was no distance left to correct it. 80,000 tons struck the Curacoa amidships at full speed and cut her clean in two, straight through her armoured hull, as cleanly as a blade. On deck, aboard the cruiser, a young seaman had watched the great grey bow swing toward him, and had time only to shout that they were going to be rammed before it happened. The stern of the Curacoa went down almost at once. The rest followed a few minutes later, barely 100 yards off the Queen Mary's side, in full view of the men on her decks. And the Queen Mary did not stop. She could not. The rule left her no choice. She steamed on with her bow crushed in, radioed the other escort ships behind her, and left the water behind her full of men. Hours later, those destroyers returned and pulled around 100 survivors out of the oil and the cold. Most of the crew were gone. By some accounts more than 200, by others over 300. Then the whole thing was buried. Wartime secrecy sealed it. The survivors were sworn to silence, and for years it went unreported, even as sailors' bodies washed up on the beaches of the Scottish Islands and were quietly gathered and buried by the people who found them. The families were told only that their men had been lost at sea. She had done nothing but obey the rule that kept her alive. That was the terrible part. The thing that made her unsinkable was the same thing that ran a cruiser under and left its crew in the water. The ship that could not stop carried on up the Clyde, back to the river that built her. Chapter 6. What the Yard Was Owed. While the Queen Mary was becoming a legend at sea, the place that had built her was living a very different story. And it is the story the ship's own does not tell. Go back to the spring of 1941. On 2 nights in March, German bombers came up the Clyde and fell on the town of Clydebank. They were aiming for the shipyard and the arms works, but bombs are not precise, and most of what they hit was houses. In those 2 nights, more than 500 people were killed and hundreds more badly hurt. Out of some 12,000 homes in the town, only a handful were left undamaged, and nearly the whole population, tens of thousands of people, was made homeless inside 48 hours. The town that built the ship, famous for outrunning the Germans, was itself almost wiped off the map by them in the dark, with nothing to outrun them in. The yard survived. It always did. John Brown's of Clydebank was one of the greatest shipyards on earth, the place that had built the Lusitania, and the battle cruiser Hood, and the Queen Mary, and her sister the Queen Elizabeth. For the men of Clydebank, that was the whole world. You were born there, you went into the yard, and the yard went on forever. Except that it did not. After the war, the same arithmetic that ruled the ocean came for the yards. Steel and labour were cheaper elsewhere, in Germany, and soon in Japan. And a shipyard on a Scottish river simply could not build a hull as cheaply as a yard that paid its men less. Order by order, the work drained away east. Clydebank built one last great liner. In 1967, the yard launched the QE2. The ship meant to replace the Aing Queens, the last of the giant Cunarders to slide down the Clyde. It was a masterpiece, and it was nearly the end. The following year, John Brown's was folded into a larger group, and in 1971 the government decided that group was not worth saving and pulled its support. And the yards faced closure. The men did not strike. Led by a shop steward named Jimmy Reed, they occupied the yard and kept building to prove it could still turn out ships at a profit. Reed warned them the whole world was watching, so there would be no vandalism and no drinking, only men doing their work with dignity. For a while it worked, and it made headlines everywhere. But the arithmetic did not care about headlines any more than the ocean did. The shipbuilding went. The yard was sold to a company that made oil rigs, and then it made nothing, and then it closed. Clydebank was left with some of the worst unemployment in Britain and the memory of a trade that was not coming back. The men of that town gave the golden age its hands. They were the first to be thrown out when the money vanished in the Depression. They were bombed nearly to nothing in the war. And when the economics that had built their ship finally turned on the yard, there was no buyer to tow the town somewhere warm and turn it into a hotel. The ship got a second life. The town got a monument. Today, above the empty ground where John Brown's used to be, one enormous crane still stands. The crane that once lifted the engines down into the Queen Mary. It is a listed structure now, preserved, a thing tourists climb for the view. It builds nothing. It is the last of the yard left upright, and it points out over the water like a headstone. Chapter 7. Something Learned to Fly. The same arithmetic that had emptied the Clyde was already coming for the ship. In 1958, passenger jets began crossing the Atlantic, and they did in about 7 hours what the Queen Mary did in 5 days. The math was not close. A jet could fly the ocean and fly back and fly it again while a liner was still halfway across. and it could do it without a crew of 1,100 and without a fortune in fuel. The shift had already started before the jets, on propeller airliners, and by the end of the 1950s, for the first time in history, more people crossed the Atlantic by air than by sea. The number never went back. The jets only made it final. The ocean liner, the whole idea of it, was finished, and everyone in the business could see it coming. Speed was the whole point. Something had simply learned to do it in the ARR. The Queen Mary grew old. She sailed half empty, an 80,000-ton ballroom crossing an ocean almost nobody needed to cross by ship anymore, and she cost a fortune to run. A long seaman's strike in the mid-1960s made a bad situation worse, and Cunard, losing money, was pouring what it had left into a single modern ship, the QE2, then taking shape on the same Clyde slipways that had built the Queen Mary 30 years before. The company could not afford both the future and the past. So in 1967 they retired her. That September she completed her 1,001st crossing of the Atlantic and came into Southampton for the last time. Over 31 years she had carried more than 2 million passengers and steamed enough miles to reach the moon and back several times over. Enter her last captain, John Treasure Jones, the man given the job of taking her away. Cunard put her up for sale, and the bids came in. The highest belonged to the city of Long Beach, California, which offered $3.5 million to turn her into an attraction. The next highest bid, the one right behind it, came from scrap merchants who wanted to break her up for her steel. She missed the breaker's yard by a single offer. Her last voyage was an ordeal. She was too big for the Panama Canal. So to reach California, she had to go the long way, all the way down and around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America. A journey of some 14,000 miles. She sailed on the 31st of October, 1967. And for 39 days she pushed south into waters she was never designed for. In the heat of the tropics, with ventilation built for the cold North Atlantic, at least one of her crew collapsed and died. On the 9th of December she came into Long Beach at last, met by crowds and fireboats and helicopters, a great grey queen at the end of the earth. Then the engines stopped and the lines went out, and she was made fast to the pier. She would never move again. Chapter 8. The Money Pit. Long Beach had bought a ship. What it actually owned was a building that happened to float, and buildings that float are the most expensive kind there is. The conversion started almost at once, and it went the way these things go. They tore out her boilers. They cut away most of her engine room. They stripped out the machinery that had made her the fastest thing on the ocean and sold it or scrapped it, because a hotel does not need to cross anything. The work was supposed to cost several $1 million. By the time it was finished, it had cost tens of millions, many times the estimate. And the city that had bought a bargain discovered it had bought an obligation. She opened to the public in 1971 as an attraction, a museum of herself, with the hotel following the year after, permanently moored. And then, for 50 years, the same thing kept happening. An operator would take her on, promising to make her pay. For a few years it would almost work. Then the surveys would come back, the repair bills would come in, and the money coming through the door would turn out to be smaller than the money going into the hull. Disney ran her at the end of the 80s with plans for a whole resort around her, and by 1992 Disney walked away. The company that took over after that went bankrupt. Later operators went bankrupt too, the last of them collapsing in 2021 and handing her back to the city, which had never really been able to give her away in the first place. because the ocean was still charging her rent. Salt water does one thing to steal, patiently, forever. She had been built with rivets, and every rivet is a place where water can begin. Below the waterline she was thinning, and above it whole sections were rusting from the inside out, in spaces no guest ever sees. In the mid-2010s, the city commissioned a marine survey to find out exactly how bad it was. The report came back and named a number: $289 million. That was the survey's estimate for the repairs she needed, most of them classed as urgent over the next 5 years, to keep her from flooding or collapsing. The city had bought her for $3.5 million. It would now cost more than 80 times that just to hold her together, and holding her together was all the money would buy. It would not make her sail. Nothing would ever make her sail again. And there was one detail in those years that says the whole thing at once. Her lifeboats had to come down. Not because she needed the deck space. Because after decades in the salt air, they had corroded so badly that the boats and their fittings had become a danger to the ship carrying them, a weight her own structure could no longer be trusted to hold. So the lifeboats of the greatest liner in the world were lifted off and taken away, and the ship they had been built to save was left riding at her pier, going nowhere, with nothing aboard to save anyone. The city has kept her. It has spent tens of millions on the most urgent work, the leaks and the hull and the life safety systems, and she is open again today. A hotel you can book a room in tonight. The pumps run underneath it all, around the clock, doing the one job that matters. She does not sink. That is the arrangement now. She does not sink, and everything else is negotiable. Chapter 9. What remains? Go down to the pier at Long Beach on a weekday evening, and she is still there. Lit up along the whole length of her, 3 funnels against the sky. People are having dinner aboard. Somebody is checking into a stateroom that once carried a soldier to England or a millionaire to New York. Down on the promenade deck, a guide is telling a small group about the ghosts, because that is what sells tickets now. Out on the waterside, where the lifeboats used to hang, the davits stand empty in a row. She is riding at exactly the same spot she has occupied since 1967. Her propellers do not turn. 3 of them were cut off decades ago. Her boilers are gone. The room where the engines used to be is a hollow space with an exhibit in it. Nothing aboard her can produce a single knot. And below all of it, below the restaurant and the gift shop and the wedding party in the old first-class lounge, the pumps are running. They ran last night, and they will run tonight, and they will run tomorrow, and if they stop for long enough, she will settle onto the floor of the harbour. That is the deal she lives under now. She is the fastest ship of her age, and she is kept in existence by machines whose only job is to stop her from going down where she stands. 5,000 miles away, on the north bank of the Clyde, it is morning. Where John Brown's shipyard used to be, there is open ground and new building, and above it the crane still stands. The one that lifted her engines into her. You can climb it now. There is a lift most of the way and a walkway at the top, and from up there you can see the whole river and the place where the slipways were. And there is nothing on them. The crane has not lifted anything in years. It is kept upright and painted and looked at. 2 pieces of steel on 2 sides of the world. One of them cannot move. The other has nothing left to lift. Both of them outlived every man who built them and every company that owned them and the entire age that needed them, and neither one knows it. The hull is still there. It is the same hull that rusted in a Scottish slipway while 4,000 men sat at home. The same hull that took the Blue Riband, that carried 750,000 soldiers through a war, that cut a cruiser in half and did not stop, that came around Cape Horn and was tied to a pier and never let go again. Riveted plates, curved and hammered together by hand, shaped for one purpose: to move through cold grey water faster than the thing beside it. It has not moved in 59 years.